We've been in a series of sermons over the last couple of months in which we've been studying the parables of Jesus. Don't you just love the parables? Kind of sounds, the word itself kind of sounds high society, doesn't it? Parables. Sounds so churchy, so religious. The parables. I have a question for you. Anyone of you ever be sitting around with your friends and say to them, hey, listen, I got this great parable I want to tell you. No? No? Nobody ever? Why not? Okay.
Or it's a joke, which is
because you don't think your jokes have that much deep underlying truth involved? Well, actually, you know, the term parable, it sounds high society and churchy to us today because, well, that's the only place we ever use it. But in reality, it's just another word for the term story. And what Jesus did was he told a lot of stories. And so we looked at his stories and we gave him this really cool name, parables. And man, they sound good, don't they, when you use that? But in fact, they're just stories. Stories that Jesus told. And how many of you love a good story? Yeah, stories are great things, aren't they? And Jesus used stories to give us an idea. And when you tell somebody a story, why do you tell them that story? Well, number one, maybe it's funny, a joke, right? Or maybe it's, yeah, what? It's something that bears repeating. It's something that you're excited about, right? And so, you know, so you tell a story like, hey, a couple of weeks ago, we went sailing, and Scott and Lisa here went sailing with us, and Scott was really excited when we asked him to go sailing, and Lisa wasn't. But, you know, after she got out there and got over her fear, am I telling any secrets, Lisa? After she got out on the water and the wind was blowing, we were sailing, it was a great day, the sun was shining, which it does, I understand, only about 71 days a year here. That's what I heard. But it was really great, and Scott's told the story like 5 times now, right? Lisa. And when we got done, I think Lisa had just a blast out there, didn't you, Lisa? And the reason we tell stories like that is because we have this amazing experience that we want to share, right? And Jesus told the parables because he had this amazing experience that he wanted to share. And what he was really excited about, and what most of his stories are about, is that he was excited about his dad. He was really excited about his dad. And so a lot of his stories were telling people about his dad. And that's cool, isn't it? And so today, as we continue in our series on the parables, what we want to talk about is what Jesus talked about, and we're going to talk about what Jesus was excited about, and what Jesus was excited about was his dad, and we want to get excited about his dad too. So we're going to take a look at a story about the waiting father. Okay, those of you that have your telephones with text access on it, I'm going to tell you to turn your telephone on. Is that different for most presentations? I always tell you to turn it off. What I want you to do is get it out, turn it on, bring up your Bible text. Or if you don't have that, use your Kindle. Or, you know, if you're like me and you have to have this paper thing, you can use that too. It works. Open it up to Luke chapter 15. And we're going to begin with chapter 15, verse 11. Because over the last several weeks, as I've made my part of the presentation about the parables, we've talked about actually 2 parables so far in 3 weeks. And those parables, those stories, are about, number 1, the lost sheep. Any of you remember, any of you here and heard the story about the lost sheep? Actually, that one took us 2 weeks, I think, right? Because we ran out of time. But if you want to get to the background, then the next story that we talked about was the story of the lost coin. Some of you were here for that, right? But the background of these 3 stories, actually maybe 4 stories, I'm not sure, but these stories that Jesus was telling was that Jesus was in trouble. You see, he was hanging around with the wrong kind of people. And so a bunch of church leaders got together, and they came to Jesus, and the local pastor and the elder and a couple of deacons and a couple of attorneys, and they got together and they said to Jesus, hey, dude, what you hanging around with that kind of people for? You see, because the kind of people Jesus was hanging around with were the wrong crowd. Any of you, when you were younger, did your parents ever say to you, come on, you're hanging with the wrong people here? Did that ever happen to you? Okay, it happened to me. I'll have to admit it. Why did your parents, if they did, no one else had that problem when you were growing up? Okay, one other person. 2 people, good. 3 people know what I'm talking about. That's great. I love to connect with the audience who knows what I'm talking about. So 3 of you were in there. But the reason your parents did that was because they believed that the people you were hanging with were going to take you down the wrong road, right? And so these church leaders came to Jesus with the same reason. They thought the people he was hanging with were going to take him down the wrong road. And so you look at the people that Jesus was hanging out with, and you got to agree with them. I mean, you do. He was hanging around with IRS agents. Any IRS agents in the crowd? Well, good, okay. He's not here. She's not here today, absolutely. But he was hanging around with IRS agents, and that's bad enough, but he was also hanging around with dock workers who had some rather colorful language. You ever been to the docks? You ever hang around with the Teamsters down at the dock? Oh, it's not Teamsters. Anyway, the guys that unload ships, the dock workers, the longshoremen. Thank you very much for getting my unions correct. Have you ever hang around? I've been around longshoremen, and they tell some interesting stories, right? And they use some interesting language. And he was hanging around with fishermen. They're just about as bad as longshoremen. And he was hanging around with prostitutes and pimps. Do you think Jesus was hanging around with the kind of kids, the kind of people that you want your kids hanging with? Maybe not. Okay? And so the church leaders, they're saying to Jesus, hey, look, if you want to be a youth leader in our church, you've got to choose a different group of people to hang with. Otherwise, no more youth leader for you. Okay? So you got the context, right? And so Jesus, as he's answering that issue that the church leaders have brought up for him, he tells the 3 stories that we have in Luke chapter 15. The first story is the story about the lost sheep. Jesus says that his dad and all of heaven celebrate when one sheep that is lost is found. Now, if you think about it, this dumb animal, the sheep, just doesn't know what he's doing, and he just wanders off, right? We talked about that several weeks ago. And he's not really understanding what he's doing. He or she, I guess it could be a female sheep that walks off too. But the sheep really doesn't know what they're doing in that regard. They're just out doing what sheep do, and they get lost. The next story, and of course the shepherd goes out and finds the sheep and comes back, and then the crux of the story is that God and all of heaven is extremely excited when one sheep who is lost, even though you've got 99 sheep that aren't lost, is brought home. God is throwing a party because of that. The next story is not the one of the many, it's one of a fewer. The lady has like 10 coins sewed into her pocket or into her garment, and one of them falls out because she's careless inside the house, not outside in the field. And then she searches hard and finds it, and then when she finds that one coin that is lost inside the church, she throws a party. So God says, Jesus is saying, my dad is really, really excited about this one lost person who is out there in the world, out there in the fields, and then comes home. But God's not just looking for that person. God is looking also inside the church for those who are lost right here in church. Anybody in church lost ever? You betcha. I've been there. Maybe you have too. And the cool deal is God searches in the church too, not just out there. But the next story is actually the one we're going to take a look at today. which is the story that we've called the parable, or the story of the what? Prodigal son. Okay? Let's put on the screen the first text only, as we look at Luke chapter 15, verse 11. The parable of the prodigal son. What's the text say? Anybody can read? There was a man who had 2 sons. What is the subject of that sentence, by the way? English professors? The man. Okay? And how many sons did this man have? So where do we get the whole concept of the prodigal son? The subject of this story is the man, and he has 2 sons, right? So I renamed it the waiting father, because the subject is not the son or the sons, it's the father. Let's take a look at this amazing story. And what I'm going to do is actually not run through the text at this moment. I'm going to just read it. So if those of you have your Bibles or your telephones or your whatever else you have that has the text on it, here's the story, or half the story so far. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Now, not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country where he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. I think the shepherd had a better deal, don't you? Oh well. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick! Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put the ring on his finger and his sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." The waiting father. You know, this is a story that's told over and over again and preached on a whole bunch. And so as I think about all the sermons that have been preached on this, I'm almost afraid to preach on it. So I'm going to have you do the preaching, okay? You guys okay with that? You ready to do some preaching here? Let's take a look at this passage together. What we discovered first of all in the very first phrase is that the story is about the father and that there are 2 sons. Now let's take a look at the next phrase, the next verse. "And the younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.'" Okay. What is the younger son saying to his father right there? Drop dead. I wish you were dead. He's saying to him, yeah. By the way, when does the estate get divided up? Upon death of the father, right? And so this young snot-nosed brat, I call him that here, comes to his dad and he says, "You know, Dad, I really wish you were dead, but you know, if I kill you, I won't get what I want. So what I'm asking you to do is go ahead and split everything up and give it to me now, because I can't wait for you to die in order to get my half of the estate. Now, another question for you. What would you be feeling right about now if you were the father? What's that? What's that? You'd be rewriting your will, you betcha. Would that kid get your stuff? Your child comes to you and said, you know, hey, I want the family car right now, and by the way, sell your house and give me the cash. Okay? I'll take 50% of it. There's two of us. But I want the cash now, so you got to sell the house, and I'll take my half of the furniture. And what are you going to do when that child comes to you and says that? Rewrite the will? Give him a good spanking? Send him packing? Okay? What are you going to do? Are you going to give him what he wants? No way. Not me. You going to do that? But look at what this father does. Go to the next slide, please. So he divided his property between them. Wow. This is an amazing father if you think about it. I read a book about this parable by a guy by the name of Kenneth Bailey. And Kenneth Bailey spent most of his life as a missionary in the Middle East. And he took this story and he went to a village. Actually, he did this several times, to several villages in the Middle East. And he read them the story. And then he asked them a few questions. He says, so the first question he asked to them was, hey, has anyone ever, in your memory, ever made this kind of request in the village? And the answer that he always got back was, never. Then he'd ask, could anybody ever make this kind of request in your village? And the answer they always got is, never. It's impossible. A son could never make this kind of request. And then they asked, okay, so if a son did make this request, what would happen? And without doubt, the question came back almost every time is, what would happen is father would beat him, of course. And then he'd ask, why? And then they'd say, because this child is declaring that he wants his father to be dead. And that is unacceptable in our village. You cannot have that attitude towards your father and live in our village. And so you put the father's response in that context. And this is an amazing father here, isn't he? So he divided his property between them. Wait a minute. Who made the request here? The younger son. We don't hear anything about the older son, do we? And yet the very response is that at that moment the father divides his property among the two sons. Again, Bailey says that in the villages in the Middle East, you have a situation where there's a confrontation or a conflict, like you have in this story, where the father and the son are in conflict. And he says the closest living relative is the one who is required to intervene and mediate the conflict. In this particular story, who's the closest living relative to the father and the son? The older brother, right? And so the older brother's role in that society was to mediate this issue between his father and his younger brother. And so we see the story unfolding and what happens in the minds of those that understood what's going on in those days. They're expecting to see the older brother step in and mediate this situation, and he doesn't do it. In fact, he's glad to take his piece of the action, right? So not only is this story not specifically about the prodigal son, it's specifically about the father's response, but it's also about the older brother's response to the situation. So we've got three characters in this play. We've got the father, the younger son, and the older son. And interestingly, Bailey, the guy that I've been telling you about, in his book, he says, the title that he gives the story is "Two Sons Have I Not." Just kind of an interesting understanding of what's going on here, isn't it? This father has two sons, but not really. Not real sons. But think about the insult as the son says to his father, "Give me my part of the estate." Let's go to the next text, next section. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country where he squandered his wealth in wild living. Okay? What does this guy do anyway? Help me out here.
Party time.
Party time. Okay? Party time. I've got my bucks and I've got my vehicle and I'm going to go downtown Seattle and I'm going to party big time. I'm going to play. I'm going to have a good time. He doesn't take the money and invest it. He doesn't go get a job. He doesn't buy a piece of property, some real estate. He goes out and he starts partying big, having a great time with Daddy's money. You're liking this kid all better and better all the time, aren't you? Yep. This is one messed up dude. But you know what? As he shoots the arrow through his father's heart, as his father watches and he says, "I wish you were a dead man so I could have my stuff." And then when he takes the stuff and wastes it on living, that the father looks at that and says, "Son, that's not the way I brought you up." And he shoots the arrow through his father's heart. And as we see that happening, you know what? We're not so different than that young guy. We've done the same thing as we have shot the arrow through our father's heart. Maybe not in the exact same details, but we've all wanted our own way, haven't we? We all want our own stuff. And with Adam and Eve, we too have wanted God out of our lives. We don't want His control. We want what we want. We want this diluted vision of freedom that we have that says that if we give our lives to God, He's going to somehow make us a slave. And with that younger son living at home, we feel like we're enslaved because, well, there's the 10 Commandments. Right? God's saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. And suddenly we feel like we're slaves. And so we think if we could just go ahead and do those things, we'd be free. And so we get this warped vision of freedom that for us, freedom looks like being outside of the control, outside of the home, outside of the family of God. If we could just get out there and sow our wild oats, we'd be free. Right? That's what this guy's saying. And we've all felt that way in our own unique ways as we've encountered our Father God. But you know what? For this young man, what he thought was freedom turns out very differently. Take a look at the next phrase. He thought if he had just the freedom to live the way he wanted, to spend the money the way he wanted to spend it, to use things for himself rather than letting the Father tell him how to spend the money, he would be free. And so he does. He goes out and spends it all. And then after spending everything, there's a severe famine in the land. Have you ever felt like there's a famine in your life? As you've wandered away from God, and as you've left the home, as you've left God behind, you start feeling like everything's dried up. and he began to be in need. Next phrase. So what does he do? Goes and gets a job. The economy wasn't doing so great, right? There's a famine in the land. The economy's tanked. And there's a lot of unemployment around. And kind of sounds like 2013, right? And so he goes out and he gets the best job he can possibly find, and that's herding pigs. And by the way, have you ever herded a pig? I haven't either. Some people have, yeah? Chase them. How do you herd pigs? Sheep, you can, I'm not a farmer, so I don't know, but I've been told that sheep, you can call them and they'll follow you. Pigs, on the other hand, they just go do their own thing. And so he's been asked to go herd pigs, and he's out there trying to corral these beasts that are out there rooting around in the mud. I have seen pig pens. Have you ever smelled a pig pen? It is disgusting. It smells horrible. And it's muddy and messy, and disgusting is about the only way you can describe it. And he's in the middle of that trying to corral these pigs. And as I understand it, if you get inside of a pig pen, your life is somewhat in danger, right? Any of you heard that? That pigs can be pretty violent, particularly a sow when she's protecting her baby. What do you call baby pigs? Piglets, thank you. I'm not a farmer, as you can tell. But I understand that if you get into a pen with an angry pig, they can rip you up. And that's what he's been hired to do, to go out there, and the pay is really good. He gets paid so well that as he's out there hanging in the slop with the pigs, he's wishing he could eat what they're eating because he can't afford anything else. Do you think his life is kind of tanked just a bit? Great point. He's trying to corral something that acted just the way he did. You think he's been a bit of a pig? Ironic that he should be herding pigs, right? When he's been one.
Now he's in the muck.
And now he's in the muck. The other thing you have to understand is that this guy's a Jew. And for a Jew, to touch a pig is a huge sin. I mean, pigs are unclean, right? And so this guy has fallen about as far as it gets. He's out there as a Jew. Was Jesus a Jew? Yeah, he was. And is he talking to Jews? Yeah. And so they think of pigs as pretty much the lowest of the low. And so this kid is out there herding pigs, and part of their ceremonial thing is if you touch a pig, you're unclean. Not only that you're in the filth and the muck, I mean, that makes you physically, literally unclean. But he's spiritually unclean as well, right? Wow, he's gone kind of down to the bottom of the barrel, and he can't even eat the pig's food. And no one will give him anything. And he's in this situation, so what does he do next? He comes to his senses. Yeah, sometimes you got to go way to the bottom before you come to your senses, right? Before finally it starts sinking into the gray matter. And he says, hey, look, my dad's got hired men who work at home where I used to live. And these guys that work for my dad on his farm, they had plenty to eat. And here I can't even get pig's food. I'm starving to death. Next phrase. So he says, I will set out and go to my father and say to him, let's see, I think we missed something here. No, I guess I didn't. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned. Was he right? You betcha he was right. He had sinned badly. He had said to his father, as much as said to his father, you're good as dead, right? That's pretty bad. That's pretty disrespectful to your father, wouldn't you say? Certainly, he has sinned against his father. I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Is that true? You bet. So what does he say then? Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and he went. Okay? So the son is thinking to himself, the guys who work for my dad, they're far better off than I am. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get up and I'm going to go home, and I'm not going to ask my dad to forgive me, particularly. I'm not going to ask for him to restore me as a son. I'm going to simply ask him to make me one of his hired guys. Hire me on.
Can I get a job?
Can I get a job, Dad? Yeah. He's going to ask for a job. Think about this in terms of the approach that we have to God. How many of us, when we are at the bottom of the bottom, and we finally come to our senses, and we say, you know, I got to return to God because, my goodness, life was so much better at home with God. How do I go about getting back into my dad's good graces? How do I go about getting back into right relationship with God? You know what? I bet you if I go get a job, then maybe I can pay him back for the stuff I took. Have you ever encountered that in your own experience as a Christian? You know, if I do all the right stuff, if I work really hard, if I'm good enough, maybe God will let me back as just one of his servants, one of his slaves. He's not asking to be a son, is he? He's asking to be a slave, a servant. And so often as we come back to God, what we want to do is we want to come back as slaves. We thought we were slaves anyway. That's why this kid left home. He thought he was a slave in his father's house. And so he left home. Now he's come to his senses and he said, well, I'll go back and be a slave again. Is that what the father wants? Does he want a slave? He had that already, didn't he? That's not what he wants. He doesn't want a slave. And so let's go on with the text. So the guy gets up, heads out, and is going home. And he's rehearsing this thing in his lines. You know, I'll get home and I'm going to say to Dad, make me one of your servants. And he's got this line all figured out. And he goes home and he's walking down the road. But while he was still a long way off, you know, the sheep, it couldn't find its way home, could it? The coin was lost in the house and it couldn't do anything about it. The son, on the other hand, he says to himself, I'm going home. And so he starts out. And so Jesus is a little bit concerned that we think that what God expects of us is that we're going to come back to him. Right? But the story here says that he's a long way off. And guess what the dad is doing? While the son is a long way away. He's checking it out, man. He's looking down the road. He's going, I wonder if my kid's coming back today. And as he's looking down the road, he sees his son a long way off. And think about the condition of the son for a minute. He's been feeding pigs. He's covered with hog slop. His clothes are ragged. He's filthy. No one would give him food, much less a bath. And he's a mess. And the father, looking down the road, he sees him. And what's the condition of the father's response to this sloppy, pig slop covered, rebellious kid who's walking down the road? What does the father do? He's filled with compassion for him. He runs to his son and he throws his arms around his son and he kisses him. The father is waiting and anxious for his son to come home. And when he sees him, he charges down the road. Now you think about this in the term of what Jesus' audience is thinking. The father is an old guy like me. You know, I've got some kids that are 18 or what? 16? 15. He wants to be 16. And my mind is going. I can't even remember my own name half the time. But the father is looking at these kids, this son, and in the context of what's going on around him, this old guy, this father, this elderly gentleman, it's absolutely dignified for him to do anything but walk in this very dignified way. You know, I'm this old guy, I gotta keep my image. And in that day and age, an older gentleman like this would never run. That's for kids. But in this story, this older gentleman, he sees his son on the other side of the village, a long ways off, and he forgets about himself entirely, and he dashes, he runs, he charges through town, while everybody's looking and goes, what on earth has gotten into this dude? What's wrong with this? Look at how disrespectful he is acting. He runs, ignoring his own standing in the community. He charges out there. Now, some of you were in India, and there's a lot of kids hanging around in India, remember? A lot of young children, and they're all out in the street all the time. As we drove through the streets, they were always out there saying, Happy New Year! It happened to be New Year's when we were there. But the kids are everywhere. And that's the Middle East where this... And so the kids, as this filth-covered sun is coming into the edges of the village, the kids do what kids do, and they make fun of people, right? You ever seen kids make fun of somebody? And here's this teenage kid coming back. They know who he is. They know what he's done. It was done right there in the middle of the village. And he's covered with filth. His clothes, he went away with, you know, these fancy duds on, looking like on top of the world. And he's coming back a total wreck. And the kids are out there going, oh, yeah, hey, check it out, look who's coming. And the father takes on all that disrespect, and he runs through the village knowing that the kids are making fun of his son, and he runs through the village to protect him. And he wraps his arms around him, and he gets covered with hog slime. And he kisses him, and the kid doesn't smell so hot. The father goes out of his way to take care and protect his son, and then escorts him through the village. And as he gets there, think of, you know, the father is putting everything about his son and taking all the stuff that the son deserves, right? And he's taking it on himself. And then the son gets there, and let's look at what the son says. But then he said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He's giving his rehearsed speech. What does the father do? Next phrase. Ignores him completely. He doesn't respond to the son's request for forgiveness. He cuts him off in the middle of the sentence. He doesn't let him finish. He doesn't let him get to the part about being a hired servant, right? He cuts him off, and he looks to the servant and says, hey, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put the ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. The dad's not interested in a new slave. The dad's not interested in another servant to work his fields. The father is looking for a son. And so what he does, if you go back into that culture, is the best robe, he dresses him in the family duds. And he puts the ring on his finger, which means he's actually, the signet ring is what the father or the head of the family wears, and they press it into the clay to do official documents. And what he's doing is he's actually giving the youngest son the ring that gives him authority as the head of the family. And he puts sandals on his feet. Next phrase. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. Why? This son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Any of you ever felt lost? Any of you ever felt far away from the Father? Yeah, me too. Any of you been in that place? Maybe you're in that place right now, where it seems like the gulf between you and God is so wide, you can't bridge it. The cool deal is, you don't have to. The cool deal is the Father is looking for you. He's watching for you. He's waiting for you. And when you turn around and say, you know, I'm going home, what He does is He runs. God is anxious. He can't wait. He runs to get you. And when He gets you, He doesn't say, yeah, okay, I'll let you work it off. He says, you know what? Right now, you are the head of the family. Right now, you are the most important person in my life. I'm going to put my best robe around you, and I'm going to give you my signatory rights, and you're going to be in charge of my estate right now. You know, the kid wanted, that's what he wanted, right? He wanted his part of the action. And so the Father gave it to him. And now he's come home, and the Father, without any request, gives him what he wanted in the first place. Freedom. And then the Father is so excited, He throws a party. Notice the theme through all three of these stories so far?
Party, 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 party.
Party, party, party. The fact is, when you turn towards God, He puts everything He is into going and getting you back. And He escorts you through the village with His arm around you, mud and all. You know, He doesn't say to the son, hey, get in the bathtub, and then we'll talk. That's what we tend to do, right? Get in the bathtub, and then when you're smelling good, we'll talk. No, He throws His arms around the son, and together they walk through the village. And He says to the entire village, this is my son. I have put my signet ring on his finger. I have put my robe around him. I've covered up his crud. You want your crud covered? That's what God does first. He runs to you and covers your crud. And then He says, this son of mine was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, but is found. You don't have to get your stuff together. God's going to do it for you. It's not about what you look like. It's about what the Father looks like. It's not about what you do to pay back the debt you owe. It's about what the Father does to restore you into His family. And He does everything that's needed to bring you back. And the really cool thing is when you do, when you come back and He's covered you in His robe, and He's put His shoes on your feet and His ring on your finger, and He's made you a part of His family again, He says, oh man, this is a cause for a party. Go get the fatted calf. Let's have a party tonight. Right? You want to have a party in heaven for you? Just say yes. Feeling lost and afar off? Just come back. Turn around. Let God throw His robe around you. Let Him draw you back in with His embrace. Let Him give you the kiss of the Father. That's what He wants to do. He's longing to do it. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. A celebration in heaven. We're out of time. And next week, we're going to talk about the other son. Okay? But notice, the celebration begins. And the older son isn't there. Think about it. Think about it. God is calling you to come back home.